So I think states that have a lot of mediation tend to keep their populations more confused about how power operates. And oftentimes, even the elites become confused about how power operates. But because everybody is confused, it's very difficult for them to be opposed internally. It's difficult to bring down a state with a lot of mediation. If you look at medieval monarchies, they enjoyed more internal legitimacy when the kings were limited and weaker and shared power with nobles and priests and the church, right? When you have a problem, it's not clear whether the king is at fault or the duke or the baron or the bishop or the parish priest. It's not clear. And if you rebel against one layer of this, the other layers may or may not decide to help you to weaken their institutional rival, right? If you rebel against a duke, the king may say the duke is in the right and put down the rebellion, or the king may say, you're right, he was a bad duke, and kill the guy and take some of his land, maybe, or redistribute it to his friends. You have this option in mediation to have intra-elite conflict within the state, and this makes it really hard for anybody to tell what's actually going on. The point at which you get all the bourgeois revolutions is the point at which these European monarchies consolidate and become absolutist. Because when they're absolutist, it's obvious where the power is because it's unmediated. Absolutism is what drove the revolution. As we moved into democracy, it became much harder to actually get people to engage in revolutionary activity. And the democracies that more often succumb to this stuff are states with very dysfunctional democratic institutions that are quite bad at taking decisions. And these democracies would fall within a relatively short period of time of their having been founded. But if you get a democracy that is able to function and take decisions, that democracy becomes very difficult over time to stage a revolution against. This is something that I just think many, many people don't grasp. I think you're quite right to point out that states that don't make any bones about where the power is are the easiest to oppose.
That's a really, really good description. I always wondered, why did feudalism before absolute monarchy, why did that last so long? I mean, the mode of production is certainly a large part to do with that, right? It's a very stable mode of production, but also why weren't more monarchies just overthrown by radical revolutions? If one is to outline laws of hegemony, so to speak, I think the way to get things done, you need a more centralized state, centralized power. But to actually maintain that legitimacy, if it delegates its own authority, if it splits it, and in ways that also can absorb its own opposition, I mean, you have a really durable system there. And I sent you one of my videos, I think it was Phantom Democracy, that one, or the two-party simulation, that one. You might have picked up on this, but there was a kind of double message going on there.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Benjamin Studebaker, a guest I've been very excited to have on my podcast. He has his PhD in political theory at University of Cambridge, and he has a book called The Way is Shut, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. A book that I would describe as an ice bath. It's a reality check for not just leftists, I would say liberals and people who are observers of American politics in general. It's a really, really bleak book, to be honest. It's fucking depressing, but it's necessary. And I think if you have the tenacity to get through it, and it's not very long, you should definitely pick it up, because I think this was very refreshing compared to a lot of the critiques of American democracy that I see. So I'm very excited to have you on to discuss this book today. And the first question I'd like to ask, in addition to introducing yourself, of course, is what did you feel was missing in the discourse regarding American democracy that made you feel you needed to write this book? Because there's a lot of books on American democracy these days.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really happy to be on here to talk about this. So, I did my PhD at Cambridge. I have noticed that on one side, you tend to have kind of liberal realist books about how great and sturdy and wonderful liberal democracy is, and how horrible it would be if anybody ever got rid of it, and how difficult it would be for anyone to get rid of it because of its manifest advantages. And on the other side, Marxist books, critical books that focus on how inadequate it is and how bad it is and how miserable it makes everybody. But generally, the people who think that American democracy is sturdy think it's pretty good. And people who think it's bad think that it's likely to eventually change or give way or evolve. And I also noticed that post 2008, a lot of Europeans were talking about the economy and the role that the economy plays in structuring what European nation states can do and in limiting what they're able to do. And in the States, people tend to not emphasize that and instead act as if it's just a question of winning enough elections or doing some procedural reforms, making American democracy a little bit more dynamic, maybe giving it European style institutions. So there's a lot of fantasy thinking about American democracy that comes from, I think, the tendency in the States to neglect the economy and class as topics, and which also come from this tendency to either think in a liberal realist way or in a Marxist or critical theorist way, rather than both of these ways at the same time. So I tried to center the economy in my account to a much greater degree than you typically see. And I try to take on board both the idea that the system is very durable and stable, and also the idea that it's miserable and it makes people very upset all the time.
That's one thing I really liked about your thinking is that you do look further into analyzing its durability, because people are always talking about crisis as if it's an impending crisis that we need to save due to a fascist threat, right? We see that all the time. And the Marxists will say it's a crisis and then it's good, and then we'll get maybe socialism or something. This is something that I've been writing about a lot, as you know, its durability, it's interested in me. But one thing I thought was very, like, probably most useful to my analysis was your analysis of the right, left, and center in America and the incentives for certain politics, the structural economic incentives. You talk about the professional left and the role of professionals, media personalities as a whole. I'd like you to elaborate on that, because one thing that I think is missed in a lot of analysis of what people might call identity politics, wokeism, or, people have all their different words for it, but a tendency on the left, professional managerial class. You talk about the structural incentives for certain kinds of politics, not just on the left, but also on the right. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I think that would be very useful for listeners.
Yeah, so something that's at the center of my view is this idea that as capital mobility increases, territorial states have a harder time managing flows of money and people. States are good at controlling things that stay in place, like agricultural land. They struggle with stuff that moves. Sometimes I like to frame the state as like a really big, strong guy with really long arms who's tied to a post. So if anything comes within his reach, he can beat the hell out of it, but only if it comes within his reach. And the easier it is to jump in and out of his reach, the harder it is for him to be able to get at you, right? The issue is that the state is not able to get itself untethered from the post that it's tied to. It's not actually able to get control of the flows, certainly not without working together with lots and lots of other states. And because of this collective action problem, politicians find that once they get into office, they have to try to distract from the fact that they can't actually solve the core problem. which is capital mobility. It flows. And the fact that the nation state is just not fit for the purpose of controlling mobile capital. So they pivot into other kinds of issues, often culture war issues, where there's no real money at stake. There's nothing really at stake in terms of revenue or in terms of wages. So it's possible to take cultural stances that make your citizens feel seen in some way. There's an increased emphasis on representation, but this representation becomes divorced from action. Instead of acting for people, you're increasingly standing for them in various symbolic or descriptive senses. So as this happens, it becomes important to sell this representation as something meaningful. That's how you get people to vote, and to problematize the representation that other sides, other factions are engaging in. So you get, first the narrative that this kind of representation is itself intrinsically meaningful, and this constant blowing up of minor culture war struggles as big existential crises. And then at the same time, you have these fear narratives about if the other side wins, not only will they get petty symbolic cultural victories, but they'll actually destroy democracy and install an authoritarian regime. So in the case of the left, I focus very much on this tendency on the left to argue at the same time that there is this impossibility of winning elections because of American democratic procedures. The procedures are always in the way. There's too much money in political campaigning, or the electoral system is rigged against third parties or what have you, right? But of course, to change the procedures, you would have to win the elections. And so there's always this bait and switch that's going on in the left between this kind of hope narrative that eventually you'll win the elections and then you'll be able to do what you need to do. And then when you don't win the elections, they go, well, the procedures, they're implacably corrupt. We can't do anything about them, right? And meanwhile, if you notice the commentary about European countries that have different procedures, very often it points out, hey, wait a minute, these other states are also struggling. They're also increasingly cutting their taxes, cutting their social programs. Well, why is that going on? It's because the procedures don't protect you against that. That has to do with the flows, with the capital mobility. No set of democratic procedures by itself gives you the ability to deal with supranational flows of money. And left-wing candidates never really go into any detail about how they would tackle these flows. And when they do try to go into detail about it, it causes political problems for them. So I talk about, for instance, Mélenchon in France.
Yeah,
Mélenchon,
noticed that. It's like very perfect timing to be reading this book right as the election just happened. He just won, whereas you were talking about him, I think, like a couple years. You wrote this 2 years ago?
Yeah. The problem that Mélenchon has is that if he threatens to take France out of the European Union or out of the Eurozone, he's viewed as an extremely irresponsible figure who has to be stopped because he poses this danger to the economy, right? But if he says, don't worry, I won't take France out of the EU or out of the Euro, then if he gets in and he's trying to negotiate with Germany or Italy or other states about reforms to the European Union, he lacks the credible threat of exit. So because he can't credibly threaten to exit, they don't have to take him seriously and they don't have to negotiate with him in good faith. So once he's in office, he needs the threat of the unilateral strategy. But the only way he can get into office is to disavow the unilateral strategy and render it non-credible. And this has happened. So as Mélenchon has become more electorally successful, he has had to go into coalition with Greens and with socialists who are very committed to the European Union. And he's had to say, oh, don't worry, I won't do anything unilateral. That's not what I'm going to do. And so he becomes more electable. But if he ever actually gets into power in France, is he going to be able to get this popular front to take a hardline stance vis-a-vis Germany and the Troika? No, that's not going to happen. And instead, there's going to be terrible infighting within that government, and probably it won't survive for very long. On the right, you get a different set of narratives, which are to do with culture and constantly framing the culture as the real reason that we're struggling, that we've just lost our virtues, we've become worse people, And if we would just get good, if we would just become better people, then we would be economically successful. The businessman who is the most virtuous is the one who gets ahead. Now, of course, this is contradicted by hundreds and hundreds of years of liberal theory, which is grounded on the premise that actually vices are good because they drive consumption, right? Business requires vice, large-scale vice, to actually do well. And it also runs away from any kind of economic explanation for why people aren't doing well. It avoids and evades that continuously, right? The function in both of these cases of this constant playing up of the cultural stuff and this constant obfuscating about what you really can do is that increasingly people are losing confidence in the ability of anybody to do anything on their behalf. And so as people lose confidence in your ability to do something for them, as the hope fades, you have to make them think that somebody else's hope, some bad person's hope is well-founded. And you get this pivot to fear and to all of these concerns about, is somebody going to destroy democracy and install fascism, install communism? You'd think if people believe that the system is not working, that they might become authoritarian. But one of the weird things that I argue is that in these kind of old embedded democracies, that doesn't happen. There's been a discrediting of the alternatives because of the legacy of the 20th century, the world wars, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. Nobody wants any of those regimes. The worst thing you can call someone is a supporter of Hitler or Stalin, right? So because of this, no matter how bad the system gets or how much people lose their belief in it, they remain worried that someone will make it worse by turning it authoritarian. And the parties can leverage that to compel people to participate and donate and vote past the point at which their hope is broken and their belief in the elites has gone.
Well, that alone is an analysis I've made in a video called Controlled Opposition, kind of, in a different way. But what I find it very interesting is most critiques of U.S. democracy that I've seen, and this is probably, I'm guessing, like part of what made you want to write your book, is the fact that most of them, they make a critique and they say that it's tending towards this greater, like, huge authoritarianism. They don't talk about how it actually is, and it's always based on, it could always get worse. I mean, and even to some extent, some of the analyses I like, such as Sheldon and Wollen's inverted totalitarianism, although it's much more nuanced and it kind of looks at inverted totalitarianism as an ideal type as opposed to something that is like an impending, actually existing thing that is going to reverse what actually exists. He thinks that it'll just be a more intense version of what is already happening in managed democracy. Because it seems like the two-party system especially, because you gave the reason of the historical legacy of alternatives, communism and fascism, right? People don't want anything that is associated with that remotely, so they don't choose that. But liberals will still hold on to the idea that, well, what if they change their mind? What if they become nostalgic? And even that, I think, that would, in a two-party system at least, that would still be virtually impossible. And the system is so good at almost sublimating the radical urges of both the far right and the far left. Like you can get a kind of contained opposition on the left that will appeal to nostalgia for socialism or social democracy. And on the right, you can get a kind of like diet parody fascism.
Yeah. And once these people get in and they don't actually follow through on anything, people assume that they never actually believed in their programs all along. But really, someone who spends their whole life trying to win electoral office is usually operating under a pretty serious delusion that they'll be able to achieve something. And when they get in, they can't do anything. They then have to find some way to tell their support base that they're doing something. And not just their support base, they have to find some way to tell themselves that they're doing something, that they're not wasting their finite time on the planet, which of course, in most cases, they are.
So you talk a lot about fallen professionals, right? And this is something that you're already alluding to with regard to like the incentives for perpetuating hope and also attaching oneself to certain cultural politics. The incentives about fallen professionals using activist language and subsequently trying to win elections in very specific areas with that language and alienating the rest, I thought to be very acute analysis of the likes of AOC. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I make this point that one of the things that we've done is we've opened up trade and opened up capital mobility. We've put traditional workers who don't have college degrees into competition with workers from all over the world. So in the 70s and 80s, the argument was made that you can still make good money in the country, in the United States. You just have to go to college so that you'll have skills that workers in other parts of the world don't have. Now, initially, when people start going to college, this works for them. But if everybody goes to college, then of course the marginal value, the competitive value of acquiring those skills deteriorates. And so what's going on now is that the bulk of people who go to college are not ending up with jobs that pay better than, when you adjust for inflation and cost of living, say steel worker jobs from the 70s. They are not giving you a higher standard of living. Indeed, many steel workers, their spouse would stay home and raise their kids. And many people are finding they can't do that with their college degree, that they have to get daycare for their kids as soon as their paternity and maternity leave runs out. And then you'll have people like Bernie Sanders say, well, with a competitive global economy, it's just not realistic for somebody to stay home. So this is, even from Bernie Sanders, an objective concession to capital mobility and to the competitive dynamics. So if that's going on with Bernie, you can bet it's going on with everybody. The approach on the left is to try to leverage the dissatisfaction that increasingly college-educated people have. The issue is that these college-educated people don't want to admit that their college degree didn't make them better than people who didn't go to college. They don't want to admit, especially if they were in honors classes in high school, that they're not better than the people who weren't in honors classes. They don't want to be reduced from that position. So they hold on to the cultural norms and the socialization that they acquired in college. And because they hold on to this, when they are in organizations with workers who didn't go to college, they have a very difficult time cooperating on equal terms with those people. They tend to lecture these people about how they ought to talk and political correctness and what is acceptable language. And when a worker is acquiring too much influence, they compete by trying to cancel that person or marginalize them on the basis of the way that they talk. The effect of this is what I call McGovernization, based on what I think authentically did happen in the Democratic Party in the late 60s and early 70s, which is the college students overrun and push out the workers and marginalize
George
them.
McGovern against
Yes. Yep. And cause them to quit. And so what happened in 72 is that a significant number of them voted for Nixon because they didn't like the way they were being condescended to. And this happens over and over and over again in left-wing or even centrist progressive organizations. So you end up with organizations that consist almost entirely of college-educated people who can only run competitive candidates in heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats that are bright blue. And they argue, well, this isn't so bad. You win the primary and then you're guaranteed to win the election. So it's low cost. It helps you work around the campaign finance problems. Yeah. It also means that all of the discourse that comes out of the movement, all of the people who are successful in the movement, will be espousing cultural politics that alienates large segments of the population. And they will not realize that there's a problem because their district continuously reinforces what they're doing, because their district doesn't look like the rest of the country. So you get this appearance of success that is Pyrrhic because it poisons the well in every other part of the country. And I think we saw this very clearly with the Squad. The Squad won in districts where Hillary Clinton was overwhelmingly popular, places where in the general election in 2016, she won more than 60, sometimes more than 70 or 80% of the vote. So they were not winning in places, rural places that Bernie Sanders outperformed expectations in the 2016 primary. No. They were winning in hardcore Hillary Clinton territory. And so they won emphasizing entirely different issues from the issues that Bernie in 2016 emphasized. A lot of it was to do with Open borders, abolish the police. This kind of stuff plays well with college educated people who are trying to flatter themselves and others that they're less racist or less sexist or more conscious of their latent racism or sexism or whichever phobia you want to talk about today. But in actuality, it produced maybe a dozen members of Congress, and all of the coverage of the left, once those people were elected, was of those people and of their messaging. And so over the course of the 2018 to 2020 period, AOC and the squad more or less displaced Sanders completely. And the activists who had been successful running those campaigns when it came time to work for Bernie in 2020 said, here's the stuff that works. Look, we won elections with it. They did win elections with it, but in heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats. And they were not prepared to adjust the messaging or the approach. And this is the thing. You have these short-term incentives to win votes, or if you're in the media, or if you're someone who talks for a living, to get clicks and advertising revenue. But the long-term political cost is very, very high. The thing is, as an individual, your career continues if you win elections or if you get enough clicks and make enough money that you can go on creating content. You have no actual personal incentive that is tied to the political objectives. And if the political objectives are really difficult to obtain anyway, it's very, very hard to even do something like Medicare for all, let alone tackle global capital mobility. A lot of people calculate that they will probably never achieve their political objectives, but they can at least get elected again, and then they'll have a seat at the table. They can at least, write some pieces, put out some videos that might get some attention, and maybe they'll raise consciousness. They convince themselves and others that this is meaningful because it's what they can do and because it's what's consistent with the incentives they immediately face.
Yeah, it seems like you're describing two sort of tendencies there. One in which I think is particular to America due to their system, and the other one I think is, I wouldn't say universal, but it is definitely a international tendency that I see, at least not only in America, but in the likes of Canada, the UK, France. I've heard from my friends in the Netherlands that it is also a problem. It seems not to be a problem in Mexico, from what I've observed about like their party's ability to, their left Bernie Sanders-ish party being able to win elections. And that is the urban-rural divide, because people will deny that using activist language is alienating. They'll deny that a sort of divide between professionals and workers really exists, because they'll say, well, students, are also workers. And like superficially, that's true. I mean, myself and all the people I went to school with were also usually working as well. And so we're like technically proletarians. But are we really though? Because, we have an education and we come out of it thinking, well, I'm supposed to get something else, right? And you either find yourself in academia barely being able to get a teaching job that pays, at this point, like almost minimum wage. As you know all too well, like it's really hard to become a professor in academia these days, and it's very hard to frankly make money. It's a very tough industry. So how do you differentiate yourself with this lack of success? I know the correct things. I'm made of special stuff. And I saw this culture firsthand, but it struck me how much this is taking place globally, because people want to say it's just, the right is making people fear these certain cultural topics that the left talks about. It's the right who's making people fear it. And I think, why is there an urban-rural divide everywhere? I mean, it must have something surely to do with an educational divide and the fact that the left is increasingly like of fallen professionals. It's made up of fallen professionals. And because generally you couldn't just attribute it to something specific. But that part about the elections, I think, is very specific, and it makes the American mess so much worse and so much harder to change, frankly. It's really bleak because of all those democratic barriers that you outlined here, but in the book you outlined so much more, like the fact that, you have to win the Senate, which is extremely difficult. You have to win Congress. It's not just like parliamentary systems. You have an election in which the parliament and the prime minister's office are they come to power through the same election virtually. France is a little more complicated, but like Canada or Britain, for example.
You do also have the problem in the EU of the different countries are on different timetables, right? They have
Right.
elections at different times. And then to actually reform the EU, you have to win elections in many different European states at once. So when we think about France on its own, it seems like it's more straightforward. Or if we think about, one of these countries. But of course, really, when we compare the United States to Europe, we should be comparing it to the EU, not to the nation states.
That's true, yeah. Because I mean, to do anything with capital mobility requires the
Yeah.
EU, right? Because
Mhm.
like if Mélenchon implements that tax he's talking about, that huge tax, what's stopping all the rich people in France from going to Belgium? I mean,
Exactly.
it's a real concern. But this aspect of winning elections in specific districts, I think, is a underrated and overlooked point because it seems like that's part of the whole hope industry you speak of, because it's easier to win an election in a Democrat progressive district using progressive lingo than flaunt that as like a victory. Oh, see, that's what we're doing. And it seems like the left can't even do that these days, though, with Jamal Bowman losing.
Yeah,
So
what's amazing is that the left often loses even in those places. And I point this out, and people then forget about the other argument, right? They go, well, they didn't lose by very much, but even if they won, they would be poisoning the well. If they won, it would be bad too. We don't win either way when we're based on heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seat. There is no winning. If you win, it sets you up to lose later. But if you lose now, then you lose now. So there's no winning there. On the point you mentioned about class, one of the reasons that Marxist frames of analysis have declined within the academy is an unwillingness to integrate into theories of class some of the things that have changed that we have to talk about, like education level. And one of the things that amazes me is that these organizations will do all of this demographic surveying about race and about gender and about religion and about income. They never want to talk about education level. Left-wing organizations never want to talk about what percentage are college educated versus not. And the reason is because if they had to confront that, they would realize they have a really, really serious diversity problem.
definitely, yeah. There's two directions we could go. One is that idea of the hope industry and the four forms of cope, the four Fs. But I think we can get at that after, because I actually think, since we're talking about electoral strategies, let's get into what I think is personally my favorite part of the book, in the sense that it really got me thinking about strategy. Because despite how bleak the book is, despite how depressing it is, you do try to at least outline the skeleton keys to potentially, or at least you posit the ideas to open up a discussion as to what we could do strategically. And one of them is this idea of the Paraparty, a sort of bigger organization that runs candidates in both the Democrat and Republican Party. I thought that was very interesting. If you would like to elaborate on what this Paraparty is, and kind of in what ways would it be better than for example, DSA's strategy today?
Yeah, so the Paraparty is there as part of this kind of thinking about what if everybody did what I think they should do? If I could get people to just do whatever it is that I think that they should do, what problems would they have? What problems would I have even if I could, command the whole left to do whatever I want, right? So I think one of the major problems that we have is that people start tailing one of the two parties and only one of the two. When you're tailing only one party, you don't have a credible threat of exit, because the party elite know that you won't support the other party because you believe that the other party poses an authoritarian threat, right? So if you think that Trump is a fascist, then you can't back the Republicans. And that means that the Democrats own you. And if you think that Biden is a communist, then you can't back the Democrats. And that means the Republicans own you. So they don't have to concede anything to you if they know that to be the case. And I think we've seen at this point plenty of evidence that that is how the party elites think. So if you were to deal with the two parties, you would have to, many people argue, break the duopoly, start a third party. Well, for one, everybody points out that third parties can't compete because of the rules. And for two, a lot of state governments have rules that mandate that if you want ballot access to the higher level offices, you have to run a primary. Well, what does a primary do? It allows outside money to capture your process and flood you with candidates that you may not want. And what has happened with third parties in recent years? Precisely that. What happens if a party starts to do well and gets attention? Outside money floods it, right? You need some control over the candidates that you would run. But you're not allowed to have a centralized party or a members-based European-style party per American electoral rule. In the United States, we have this notion that primaries are democratic. And if you don't pick the candidates through a primary, you're engaged in some kind of authoritarian practice, that you have an administrative party that is bureaucratized and evil, right? So you're not going to easily change the rules about the primaries. They're quite insidious and very clever. So what can you do? Well, this thought is that you could have an organization that drafts candidates to run in the two parties. So now your organization isn't technically a party, so it doesn't have to follow the rules that parties run by. It can pick its candidates with its own rules, but you have to run the candidates in the primaries of the competitive two parties. That costs a lot of money because now if you're going to not run in gerrymandered safe seats, you have to actually run candidates in places where there's both a competitive primary and a competitive general election. Well, maybe you could run candidates in both parties at the same time. So that would give you a little bit of a better chance. Even if you lost one of the primaries, maybe you'd win the other primary. If you're willing to be flexible with regard to culture and you're willing to work across cultural divisions, maybe you can pull that off. You allow people running as Republicans to tack to the right on social issues, and you allow people running as Democrats to tack to the left. And you try to create a situation where there's a consensus on the economy. I mean, that's what the neoliberals already do, but they do it with their economic policies. So maybe we could come up with a different economic consensus and run candidates in both parties on that basis. Well, even if you do manage to start getting somewhere with this and you start winning a significant number of races, you can't win all the races all at once. For one, the way the Senate is elected straightforwardly prohibits it, right? So there's going to be a period where you don't command majorities, but you have to look like you're doing something useful. And in that period, you have to resist the urge to just start doing culture war stuff. So you have to come up with something you can do that is meaningfully economic. You have to, at the very least, point out the people who are obstacles to what you're trying to do, call attention to those people. And I say, well, maybe you could do something with housing because land use, land is fixed in space. Land can't run away from you. So maybe you can do something with housing or land use. And all the states
laws
have
are
different
local
rules
laws.
regarding that. Yeah. There's all sorts of local rules. You'd have to learn them. You'd have to study the specific location you're in. I mean, this could all be done. It's just hard and people don't want to do it. And people love to just instead try to do state versions of federal policies that don't really work at the state level. Like in Michigan, there was this talk about doing a state version of Medicare for all. But that won't work because Michigan is an open border with Indiana. So if you're a medical doctor, why would you want to work in a state that is trying to control costs through a state single payer system? You would just choose to practice medicine in a state that's not trying to control the costs? Wouldn't you? So I think that a lot of state level policies are not well conceived because they are just attempts to port federal policies to the state level without thinking at all about flows. You'd have to avoid those mistakes and instead focus on something that you actually can get control over, like land. And maybe gradually, if you did that, you might get to a point where you are starting to gain steam nationally. Then you would get to the point where you're in the Mélenchon position and you have to decide, okay, are you going to try a multilateral strategy where you talk to other states and try to change the rules? Or are you going to try to have the United States break the system of capital mobility by behaving like a rogue state? Or are you going to threaten to do the latter so that you have more credibility when you negotiate for the former? Or will any attempt to try to even threaten to do the latter cause you so much trouble politically that you can't get away with that. So you'd have to find a way to manage to win with a real credible threat to actually exit the system of capital mobility.
You need a crisis.
Realistically, you need a crisis. Exactly. You would need a crisis.
State
So
of
you'd either
emergency
need
to
to
declare a
luck into
war on.
one, yeah, or you'd have to engineer one. And a lot of the crises that you could engineer would involve a major risk of war, major war, potentially with China in the Pacific. Those are the kinds of conflicts that are serious enough and big enough to disrupt capital mobility in such a way that they would restore to the state its ability to control the flow. And those wars are, that kind of stuff is really, really nasty stuff.
You mean like literal wars? Like you
Yes.
mentioned the war in Ukraine in the book. But what
It's
about
too
like
small. It's too small to do that, right? Like if you look at any of the wars that have been fought since World War II, they are all too small to disrupt capital mobility in the first world, right? First world capital mobility continued in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq. All of those conflicts didn't do anything to meaningfully dent capital mobility. And we saw that oligarchs and corporations gained power even when there was a robust second world, right? Even when states had an option to either be part of the first world system with GATT and the IMF and the World Bank, or to be part of the Soviet sphere, it was still the case that capital mobility dramatically increased over the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that leverage leaked away from workers in the first world throughout that period.
would you say climate change in the future could be like an impetus to pose restrictions on capital mobility? Because I mean, one country that does impose restrictions on capital mobility already to an extent is China. Like China is one of those countries that actually a lot of investors, I've noticed, complain about investing in, because once you're locked in, you're locked in. It's very difficult to like, sell very fast. You have to hold it for a certain amount of time. And I guess maybe they've somehow avoided the Chile problem that way, because Chile had all this investment right after they deposed Allende and got Pinochet, but then in the 90s or some around that time, a lot of like there was a capital flight in Chile, and their economy just got nuked, got destroyed. So I'm not sure if
Yeah.
you think that the question, I guess, would be rather, does it necessarily have to be like that serious for restrictions on capital mobility? Because I think if you start getting like hurricanes all the time, you could do something like we declare a war on such and such, and you can justify what would otherwise be called by liberals as authoritarian policies that, fix prices on certain things and puts restrictions on capital.
So I think that there's a greater chance of restrictions on labor mobility. Workers are always at a disadvantage because it's harder for them to move than the money. The money is always more liquid than the laborers. And one way you can look to your people like you're doing something about the flows is to restrict immigration and to prevent refugees from moving into your country. We will often see states talk up what they're doing about immigration to cover for the fact that they're not doing anything about money. And I think as climate change intensifies, there will be major efforts to restrict the flow of people, which will mean that many workers will get trapped in states where there's no money and they'll suffer and they won't be able to find good work, right? While at the same time, the rich states will continue to trade with states that they're friendly with. And we're seeing a lot of friendshoring, efforts to make sure you're trading with states that are part of your alliance structure. And that's what I think the United States will endeavor to do. It will try to decouple from China and from any other state that become joined to a Chinese bloc. And it will instead friendshore as many jobs as possible in friendly states as part of trying to create a containment ring around China and construct a kind of Pacific NATO.
Yeah, those are all very. That gives us a lot to think about, certainly, doesn't it? But that's already presuming that this left party has political power. by kind of backing candidates within both parties. And I guess the reason why this strategy seems so unlikable, I think many leftists would be very resistant to it because of our purity fetish. The idea of running a candidate in the Republican Party seems you're tailing bad ideas. And as you mentioned, the neoliberals are happy to push their economic agenda and kind of make little tweaks culturally left or right. But that would be, instantly cancelable. Now, I'm skeptical of attempts to tail only one type of person, which is why, I think there's a progressive echo chamber, like a total bubble. That's the more dominant part of the left. But I'm also skeptical of MAGA communism, which has a kind of parody idea of what American workers are like. They think that you can just plaster an American flag, and if you say some bad things about LGBT people, that Trump voters will support you. I think it's kind of naive. But this idea of running in two parties, I mean, it's not totally historically unprecedented, I guess, in the sense that, both parties have gone in progressive and less progressive directions. They're
guess what? It's what the neoliberals did.
And
it's
then
what
not
they
only
did.
But as you mentioned, it's kind of we have to do this because with a primary system, it's going to get flooded by outside influence anyway. So if you don't influence the other parties, other forces will influence your party, no matter how ideologically pure you try to make it. And this is what people forget about the American system. It's like the fact that it's in many ways more democratic, its primary system, makes it less democratic in the sense that it's more susceptible to capital influence. And
Hey, nobody
say this
agrees
to
on what
liberals.
democracy means, right? And so you have a lot of people who would say that the nominating process in the United States is the most democratic process for picking candidates in the world. And if you understand democracy in the way that they do, they would have a case. One of our major problems now is that we do not agree on what we like about democracy. We may all agree that in some sense or other, we should have a democracy and not an authoritarian regime. But we have no idea what we mean by that term anymore. And attempts to impose a meaning or to appeal to some shared meaning that we're meant to have don't work as a consequence of this. I fully agree with you that most people are not at all willing to try my paraparty strategy. And even if they tried it, it probably wouldn't work, because even if they did manage to get into power, the chances that they would actually manage to find a way of cooperating with, say, China or cooperating with the European Union to rewrite the rules, very low. But, I think that if you wanted to have a credible threat of exit so that you could get people to rewrite the rules, well, then you would need to have some of these nationalists running around, not for the purposes of having them win, but for the purposes of giving you a credible threat, right? You're not going to have one person who can be for both the multilateral and the unilateral approach at the same time. The electorates for those approaches are too different. So you would need to have two different movements that are opposed to each other in one sense, but which ultimately help each other. But this is too much for our professional class talkers. They're not willing to deal with all of this. This makes them too unhappy and uncomfortable, so they'll never do it.
Yeah, the coddling of the American left. That could easily have been a title of your book as well, in some ways, if you wanted to play on that classic title.
I could have written a more about the left. I made a point to try to talk about all the different parts, because I did not want my book to be viewed as an attempt to push people out of the left and into the right.
Right. Yeah. Well,
so I also problematize those unilateral approaches. If you tear up capital mobility, all of a sudden you will have major increases in the cost of everything. You'll have inflation. You won't win the next election doing that. And that's why when Trump got into office, he ran away from all of that protectionist stuff as soon as the COVID pandemic hit and he got worried about the economy. He didn't see the pandemic as, oh, here's my opportunity to do something really disruptive. He went, oh, no, now my economic figures are tanking. I better run away from all of the scary policies.
Yeah, well, especially with protectionism, it makes perfect sense why that would be a pretty bad idea when supply chains are already down. You would just increase inflation. But I try to tell this to liberals sometimes that the systems of Canada and Britain, the way party structures are, it's a lot like vanguard parties. And people love to criticize Soviet vanguard parties, that it's not like a very democratic way of organizing. And I mean, is how our systems work. The American ones are more democratic. You have like a primary and stuff, but it's also way more of a mess because of that. And this is why funding is so important in America. It's more important than anywhere else. And the left loves to use funding as an excuse for why they lose, but not actually pose solutions as to funding. And this is an interesting, maybe controversial point you make in the book, which is that to solve the funding problem, we can't rely just on unions due to changing class composition, and that inevitably any radical movement, any successful political movement, even if it's radically left or whatever, will need some oligarchs to support it. Now, elaborate on what you mean by that, because that's going to be a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. So the unions are not capable of performing the role that we'd like them to perform. They weren't capable of performing this role in the 70s when they were large numbers of factory workers engaged in heavy industry, right? In the 70s, the unions were defeated by rich people because of the level of capital mobility that already existed in the 70s. It was so much higher than the level that had existed 20 to 30 years prior that the ability of the unions, even though they had grown in size over the course of that 30-year period, to contend with the flows had been greatly diminished. American workers had been put in competition with German workers and Japanese workers, and even that by itself greatly diminished their leverage. Even in a world where there was a second system, where many states were not part of the first world system, were not part of the alliance structure, weren't parties to GATT, even in that world, capital mobility had increased enough that these old-fashioned unions that were big, that were more than double the percentage of population that they now include, and in the factories, those unions were not able to deal with those changes. So how is it that unions that are much smaller, and even though people have tried to grow the unions as a percentage of the workforce, they have not grown. They've grown in terms of raw numbers of members in recent years, but not as a percentage of the workforce, right? And the unions are overwhelmingly now in professional government jobs, in white-collar jobs, and in service jobs, in retail, in food service. You shut down a Starbucks, you do not cost your employer millions upon millions of dollars a day. You shut down a factory for even 5 minutes. You have to restart the factory, which is a whole process, especially with those old-fashioned factories from back in the day. If you shut down a factory for 5 minutes, you could cost your employers enormous amounts of money in the 70s. No union has access to that kind of leverage. And this is why Marxists talk about things like the commanding heights, that real proletarians are controlling necessary materials or necessary resources. That's not to say that people who work at Starbucks aren't workers. They are workers, but their unions don't have the same kind of leverage because of the sector that they work in. It's not to impugn them or to diminish them or suggest that they're in any way less than.
Yeah, it's like, well, how are they going to hold the economy hostage? They can't really do a railroad strike, or they can't, do what coal miners did, which is also a big reason why oil was propped up as an alternative to coal because of capital mobility. But yeah, like, I guess it's not just like organizing the workers, it's what can the workers do? That's often really forgotten.
Yeah, and capital mobility really undercuts your leverage because especially as these factories become easier to pick up and move, they become more like Lego kits. It's quicker to take them apart, move them somewhere, put them together somewhere else. The easier it is to move the factory, the less reason you have to negotiate with the workers in any particular place. And the less reason you have to negotiate with the state in any particular place. So if even in the 70s you couldn't win that fight, how are you supposed to win that fight now? It would seem to me that the only way you could get enough resources to compete would be for there to be some oligarchs who are class traders, who sympathize in some way with what you're doing. Now, of course, people will make the point that what if these are opportunist oligarchs who just want power for themselves and are using the workers to empower themselves? Well, yeah, you won't be sure that they're not. And some people will try to fool you, and sometimes you'll get fooled. but you don't have a way of generating sufficient independent working class power to do without these people. So either you go, well, I won't work with any oligarchs, in which case you never get enough resources to get where you need to go, or you do work with oligarchs and sometimes they deceive you. It makes it pretty hard, doesn't it? That's why the book's called The Way is Shut.
Definitely. And you do mention that historically a lot of radical left figures have had their beneficiaries, or they've had wealthy patrons like Engels and Marx, most famously. Marx had his sugar daddy. So get yourself a sugar mommy or sugar daddy if you haven't already. That's the lesson, though.
I
But
always talk about, the four Ps, the four
yeah,
patrons:
yeah,
parents, partner, your patron, or, a professional institution. And everybody who talks for a living, or who talks about politics, or who spends the bulk of their time engaging in politics gets money from some combination of those four sources. Nobody's independent. So it's just a question of which combination of those things you're going to rely on.
yeah. I mean, that's why I ask my audience for patrons all the time for for donations, because, like, yeah, of course. I mean, ad revenue it's either that or sponsors or ad revenue, or you take like weird money from somewhere. So yeah, it's
If you
pretty
have
difficult.
living rich parents,
Yeah,
get their
that.
money.
Oh yeah. I mean, that was something I thought was interesting. Is going to grad school, I noticed there was like quite a few people who had like very wealthy parents, and they'd be talking about like organizing the workers and stuff. And I'd be like, wait, how do you like, what do you do for a living? You know, it would be, and I'm for class traders, like nothing wrong with that. But if one is self-aware of what one is doing, because it's easy to be like, well, if I have the ideology, if I identify with the proletariat, I am the proletariat, you know, or I understand. It's like you're just not in that position, like even
Nothing wrong
just
with being a class trader. It's fun.
yeah.
Own it. It's a
I
cool
mean,
thing to do.
what's interesting is now through doing like YouTube and podcasting full time is I make less money than I did working full time. But when I was working full time, I definitely feel I'm more like in many ways out of touch with workers than I was then. Even though already then it's kind of out of touch because it's like office jobs are different from, industrial work, but still it is like a different mindset in the sense that when you're like a full-time student or a full-time like, video essayist, podcaster, whatever, you have so much time to read. Whereas when you're working, you just come home, you want to watch Netflix. I just noticed that you can't be mad that people don't read, and you especially can't be mad if people aren't like adjusted to the latest correct opinion on such and such social issue, which I think is probably the biggest barrier to like any kind of pragmatic cross-party strategy. That's going to be the first contradiction to get over first. But with this point about oligarchs, I think a counterpoint some people would say is that, well, Bernie Sanders got mostly donations from his supporters. So,
Mhm.
and he did raise a lot of money. Can't you just raise a lot of money from a lot of people and, have no rich people give money to you? Is
For
that
the
not?
president, if the president were enough to fix the country, then they might have a case. But we don't have an elective monarchy. We might have a better chance if we did.
Yeah, it's true. The decentralization makes it pretty hard, doesn't it?
But, this is a compound republic. It's not going to become an elective monarchy.
It's weird because America, the president on paper has more power than the prime minister of Canada or Britain, but they actually have way less in terms of the fact that, if you have elected majority, the prime minister can do virtually whatever they want within the, space of the constitution. And even then they can kind of just create a new constitution like Pierre Trudeau did back in the day. So America, it's the checks and balances make it really hard. I've tried to cover that as well. And that's certainly an obstacle. So I guess the important thing is running primaries, but not just in progressive districts. It's running in all of these centers of power, which will require being ideologically adaptive.
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, how do
And
you,
the
if you
prime
have wealth,
ministers,
what reason would an oligarch have though to back someone who has socialist sympathies or even socialist policies? What incentive would there be for them? Because I guess if you're like a very orthodox Marxist, I mean, even just common sense, I would say, based on common sense, is like, it wouldn't be in their interest. Why would they do it? Even if they're class traders, what power motive would they have to back?
well, there's of course, the power motive. There are also, people who have savior complexes, people who have weird personality quirks. But I think also a lot of really rich people aren't worried about themselves because they've got plenty of money. So they're not thinking in terms of economic interests to the degree that you might expect. A lot of people who have real money realize that the point of having money is not having to think about money all the time, that you can have other values, that you can love things and pursue them for their own sake without thinking about whether you make or lose money by doing them. And this is the way aristocrats used to think back in the day. And not everybody who's got money thinks like an aristocrat. That's why aristocrats always drew the distinction between old money and new money.
Oh yeah.
Old money knows what money's for. New money doesn't get it yet. But new money will figure it out if it keeps it long enough. That's the implication of that argument. I think that you have to have a sense for the soul of a person. Aristocrats always talk about, what does somebody really love? Do they love the money? Do they love the status that they can get? Or do they love the good in itself? Are they religious? Do they have a kind of abstract principle that they are driven by? These kinds of things can be useful to us. But you got to be on the ball because people are very good at pretending that they care about principles when they're out for status. And if status is tied to following good principles, people who are status pursuers can look identical in their behavior to people who care about the principles in themselves. And this is a confusion that is always an issue in aristocratic thinking. How do you tell the difference between the aristocrat who just is doing what they need to do to get ahead and the aristocrat who really gets it? And this is a problem in Platonism. It's a problem in Confucianism. It's a fascinating problem. It's one that we have to wrestle with because we don't have labor unions that are capable of getting the job done.
Right. And also just the proletariat being a kind of precariat, lack of stable jobs. I mean, very difficult to organize gig workers. So this idea of like industrial union socialism or anarcho-syndicalism is kind of a pipe dream at this point. But when it comes to funding, I thought that was a interesting observation about like meaning and power motives, because this is if you actually like observe a lot of these rich celebrities, because they are the ones who put their lives on display. What I find fascinating, there's a total crisis of meaning, and can analyze this from all sort of abstract angles as to why there's a crisis of meaning. But you have like these celebrities like Shia LaBeouf, like they become Buddhists. Famous celebrities, they read books and they show it on their Instagram saying how to be happy, or they get into like weird Eastern spirituality. There's or overdosing on drugs, just becoming straight up depressed. It's not like their life is perfectly great. I mean, they just kind of move on to different problems and money doesn't matter, but they have like a lot of motives to support in that, insurgent political movement that might not be for good reasons, but who cares? Sometimes people who are for support movements, not for good reasons, right? Like, I think, you ever watch Mr. Robot, the TV show?
I don't think I've seen Mr. Robot.
It's fascinating. I don't think it's politically all that deep because it doesn't try to be too like obviously left and right, even though it's kind of obviously a bit anarchist left. But it shows that there's even like the motives of the main character he's this hacker. He wants to kind of save the world from rich people. He has very selfish, narcissistic desires for power, as well as the powerful guy who ends up collaborating him, who's like a class traitor, this Patrick Bateman-esque CEO guy. He kind of ends up collaborating with him because he just hates his own people. He's been done wrong. So it's all about selfish motives, even if they're on cause that might be correct. So I think that's something worth looking at. But Marxists will tell you, they'll respond to you probably in the comments saying, you're advocating class collaborationism, which is what fascism advocated for, which means,
Well, fascists were for essentializing about groups of people on the basis of ethnicity, race, religion, and targeting some of them as enemy groups. And I am not for any of that. I am against the essentializing of races. I'm against the essentializing of ethnicities, nations, peoples. I don't think that people should be classified as enemies on the basis of arbitrary criteria like that. I don't really think that friend enemy distinctions are an appropriate way to think about the political in general. I am not a Schmittian. I'm against that kind of thinking across the board. If you're just talking about, any kind of interacting among classes, as necessarily fascist, I think that's a very silly way of trying to define fascism. I'm sure some people will do that, but that's really just a way for them to police discourse and to stifle ideas that they don't like. The thing is, you can say that everything other than a very orthodox, old-fashioned 19th century approach is very right-wing and bad. All it will do is mean that you waste your life doing nothing, and accomplishing nothing for anybody. So that's what I would say to that kind of argument. One thing I wanted to point out, a lot of people have a kind of opposition to any sort of religious thinking because they're mainly familiar with the exoteric iteration of religions. All of the major world religions have both an esoteric and an exoteric iteration. The exoteric iteration is for the workers, and its purpose is to keep them in line. The esoteric iteration is for the rich people, and its purpose is to help them think about what is meaningful and how to live a meaningful life. And that esoteric tradition, it's less dogmatic, it's less textual, it tends to be more apophatic and mystical, and it tends to involve various kinds of meditative and ascetic practices that are not compatible with working full time, right? So all of these religions have built into them, because they developed in a period where the class distinction was taken for granted, divisions in the way that you approach the religion. And so people should not be so hasty to assume that the exoteric, very rigid, very dogmatic, or fundamentalist iterations of religions are exhaustive, or that they contain all that there is in those traditions or schools of thought.
very fascinating. And you're tempting me to go into a rabbit hole about religion, but I will not do that because that is something I'm too interested in, which will delve us in a completely different discussion, which we can have at some point. Political theology is something I like to study a lot. I'm not a Schmittian, but I do like to study rather the political theological problem, as the political theorists will call it. But
let's definitely do that at some point. I'd love to talk to you about that.
Yeah, I could tell just the way you talk about reading exoteric and esoteric, and just your background, and you were at Chicago. I can tell the different thinkers you've encountered, so that'll be an interesting conversation. But speaking of class, you define class in a very different way than not just the mainstream conventional way, but also from Marxists. You have the categories of the oligarchs, the employers, the professionals, and the subaltern, which is like, of course, a term Antonio Gramsci used, but it's what you use to describe the working class and more broadly the poor. Why do you choose those terms instead of like petite bourgeoisie, proletariat, bourgeoisie, etc.?
Well, so there's certainly a lot of Marxism and critical theory that influences my book. But one of the things I've noticed is that if you make these arguments in terms that are more familiar to liberals, it's easier for the argument to be comprehended by a wider range of people, including people who have less aloof education. And one of my objectives always is to present my ideas in such a way that they can be understood by people who have not gone to college, or who have been away from college for a long time, or who hate confusing, meandering, badly written texts. I sympathize enormously with these people. They're constantly being screwed over and pushed around. So I try to be comprehensible to them, and that's one of the reasons I chose to frame things in this way. Another reason I chose to frame things in this way is I kind of want to make the point that apart from the oligarchs, every other part of the population is unhappy and is suffering. The small employers are constantly stressed out that local conditions in their area will ruin their business, that their business will be attacked by criminals, or that their customer base in the local area will become too impoverished, or that the wages in the local area will become too high for them to survive. So they're constantly full of anxiety and very unhappy. And that resentment and unhappiness is very easy to politically activate. The professionals, we talked a little bit about why I feel there's a need to talk about education level, because there is this political problem. The professionals are estranged from the workers, even if we wish that were not the case, even if we think it shouldn't be the case. It is the case, and it's a problem we need to talk about and work through instead of denying that it exists. And within the professionals, I make a distinction between the rump professionals, the professionals who make it, who get the plush job, who end up getting what it was that they looked for from the college experience, and the fallen professionals who are declassed and proletarianized but don't want to be and who resist that. And I make a kind of analogy. Just as the petty bourgeoisie small employer tails the oligarch and aspires to be like the oligarch and identifies with the oligarch, the fallen professional tails and follows the rump professional. And that's a big part of why they don't identify with the workers, or if they do identify with the workers, it's not in a way that's compatible with their actually working with the workers. Ultimately, the people they admire are the administrative experts, the people who made it, the people with the fancy degrees. They don't admire people who don't go to college. Those are not their friends. So that's another major reason that I do the distinction in that way. With the term
Talk about the hot air
subaltern.
balloon.
Yeah, the hot air balloon.
Balloon,
Yeah.
yeah, the hot air balloon.
Yeah, the hot air balloon is a metaphor I have for professionals, right? Everybody at some point in time hasn't been to college, and they're dealing with all the same material issues that everybody else deals with, worrying about what you're going to do. Even if you come from a wealthy family, most people, their parents expect them to eventually be self-sufficient. So there's this question of how will you sustain yourself, right? And so most people, when they're in high school, they have broadly similar concerns about adulthood. But if you go to college and you manage to make it as a rump professional, you get what I call the hot air balloon, which is the ability to get off the ground where all of the normal, ordinary problems are. And as you get off the ground, the time that you have to read and talk and think about things, allows you to see a little bit of what's going on. You become better read, and you do manage to see some things that people who are on the ground, who are busy dealing with the problems, aren't able to see. And perhaps for a little while, you're able to call down to people on the ground and suggest to them things they might do to manage a little bit better. And the people on the ground are able to shout up to you and go, hey, I'm having a trouble. This obstacle, there's a fire here. There are wild animals chasing me. They're able to say what it is on the ground that is menacing them. And you might be able to see somewhere for them to go. And initially, it might seem like you guys are friendly and are working together. The thing is, you get a nicer balloon the higher up you go. And you can see more the higher up you go. And the higher up you go, the harder it is to hear anybody on the ground. Now, for a while, you can get a bullhorn, and you can be heard by people on the ground. But you're not going to hear very much of what they're saying if you're shouting at them through a bullhorn. And the higher and higher up you go, the more you are just looking at the other balloons and comparing your balloon to their balloons and going, well, why don't I have a nicer balloon? And if you resist this process, your balloon might be popped. And then you might be stuck back on the ground. And then you'll be really unhappy because you'll have a memory of what it was like to see things from way up there. And you will not be able to easily reconcile yourself to your new situation, or rather your old situation, the situation you always feared ultimately being dumped back into. So the effect of all of this is that people tend to go higher and higher and higher and higher up until they can't be heard by anyone. And at that point, the oligarchs are happy enough to move on, let them drift off into retirement and go give the next kid on the ground a new balloon. And the whole process begins again. And I think over time, the result of this is that people on the ground learn to fear the balloonists. They learn to regard these people as representatives of some kind of sinister force. They tend to form conspiracy theories about where they come from, about who's really in control of them. And over time, instead of the balloonists helping the people on the ground, the balloonists are increasingly treated as a menace and as a threat. And so the people on the ground who never get balloons become a kind of subaltern. They can't make themselves heard. They can't do anything. They can't act. They're always being ascribed these political capacities. They're citizens. They should vote. They should be informed. They should do all of these things. But they can't actually do anything with those capacities in practice. They don't have any time. They don't have any energy. And so in practice, they're constantly being denigrated for not being able to do things that they haven't been given the resources to do. And they understandably come to resent all of the people who talk bad about them.
Yeah, that actually ties into your discussion of Plato and Plato's category of like the rhetorician and like the people who do the talking in democracies, critique of ancient Greek democracy, which we'll talk about in the back room. But first, I'd like you to finish what you were saying about the subaltern and your choice of that term, because you were initially describing that, you didn't quite get to finish.
Yeah, a lot of people have a kind of Spivak view of the subaltern. They think of the subaltern as a non-citizen, whereas I follow what I really think is the original Gramsci, because Gramsci was talking about the subaltern in reference to Italy and France. The subaltern is ascribed the capacities of the citizen, but is not able to actualize those capacities, has more in common with, say, Balabar's citizen subject. So the subaltern is said to be able to exercise citizenship, but in practice can't really do any of it, can't really do these things. And so is always in the position of being told they have all these political capacities that they don't really have. And I think that's very frustrating. It's a very frustrating situation to be in, because anytime you try to use them, it doesn't work. And then if you don't use them, you're picked on for not using them. Real lose-lose.
Definitely. Before we transition into the back room to discuss democracy and what democracy means, as well as your very interesting critique of or analysis of Plato's critique of democracy, and also I think something that might have been missed, but I want to discuss in the back room just because I also have some ideas on this, which is legitimacy and the way you talk about that. Before we get into all that, I think what would be useful for the audience on the public part of this episode is the 4 Fs. Because when it comes to dealing with unpleasant problems like this that require us to think ahead, that require us to have foresight, it's a lot of tenacity that people just don't have, and often in the response we just get some kind of cope. And you have this, what I'll just call a no cope mentality, or a cope resistant mentality, which I really like. It's not the most pleasant way to live, but I think if you're inclined to philosophical thinking, it is the way to live. But what are the four Fs that you talk about? Because the way I see it is it's 4 Fs, 4 times forms of cope, or ways to deal with like this political impasse we have.
Yeah, so I try to be empathetic here. All of the 4 Fs are legitimately interesting things that many people are drawn to for many reasons, not just because it's an escape from the political and from our problems. So I'm not trying to make anybody feel terrible. I myself am drawn to all of these things, all of them. So it's not at all about trying to be nasty about it. Nevertheless, I do think it is very clearly the case that one of the reasons people engage in these 4 things is that they are comforting as an escape from politics. So the first, of course, is faith. The second is family. The third is fandoms. And the fourth is futurism. So I think sometimes people imagine that faith and family are conservative and fandoms and futurism are liberal or something. But that's not how I intend to do this at all. You will find both progressive and conservative iterations of all 4 of these things. There are very conservative Star Wars fans who hate the new Disney movies because they've ruined Star Wars as far as those fans are concerned, right? There are people who don't like nuclear or traditional families, but who have put an enormous amount of emotional weight on their household, their commune, their ashram, their group. All 4 of these things can be done from both directions. Recently, the most politically active churches in the United States are Black Protestant churches, not evangelical white churches, as people might be inclined to think based on memories of the 2000s or the Bush administration. In many cases, those evangelical churches that used to be politically active have burnt out. What you'll find also is that church attendance rates are higher among college-educated professionals, but rates of belief are higher among non-college-educated workers. Workers don't tend to like professional priests because professional priests are balloonists in many cases and menace them with attempts to repoliticize them. So all of these zones are complicated and have lots of different things going on in them. None of them should be reduced to a narrow stereotype. But I think that in all of these cases, people go to these zones to get away from the political, to pursue their values in the private sphere in some mediated way with some other institution or structure that's not obviously a political structure playing the role of uh, political space or public space. So it can be a church, it can be a family structure, it can be a corporation that provides entertainment products, it can be a tech company or a company that's anchored by a genius or so-called genius CEO like an Elon Musk or a Mark Zuckerberg. Uh, all of those are possibilities for people. The issue is that because so many people retreat into these enclavist zones, they are very attractive places for political professionals to set up shop. Political professionals will recognize that there are fringe voters in these spaces, people who sometimes can be activated to vote, but often will not vote if a deliberate effort is not made to activate them. So instead of trying to win the swing voter, the increasing emphasis is on the fringe voter, the person who only sometimes votes. And the way that you get this person to vote is by creating a sense in them that their enclave is being threatened or menaced in some way by some political force. And in many cases, it is the case that as capital mobility increases, it becomes harder to financially support these organizations, or these organizations become involved in cultural struggles. In the case of the tech companies and the entertainment companies, all of the disputes about representation, all the disputes about the culture war are replicated in or across those companies. We now have a world where increasingly Zuckerberg is the Democrat social media oligarch and Musk is the Republican social media oligarch. And if you are on Twitter X or if you are on Meta Threads, you are choosing a team in some sense. That seems to be the emerging paradigm, especially with Musk publicly coming out for Trump recently. Similarly, with the entertainment companies, you will constantly have disputes about representation in entertainment media that will replicate all of the culture war struggles that you see in regular politics. And the situation for households is becoming very dire. It's becoming really hard to economically support a diverse array of households. And I mean that in both conservative and progressive senses. Whether you're trying to build a commune or you're trying to build a nuclear family, you will notice that you're increasingly resource constrained and that economic problems increasingly overdetermine the forms of household that are available to you. So even though the household seems to be this place where you can pursue values that are not economically optimized, the cost of running households is heavily constraining what people can do. And the churches have to compete with each other in a religious marketplace that pushes them to adopt market competitive postures that can be very alienating to people who want non-market values, who want human values that are not easily activated or pursued through market mechanisms. So I think all of this stuff is very attractive, but it all can lead back into politics, unfortunately, because none of these zones is truly safe from the political. None of them are truly as private as people would like to think.
Yeah, you have some interesting statistics I was actually just trying to find, but I couldn't find them in time. But regarding the difficulty of having families is pretty insane. Like, I knew this already, but the extent to which people are living by themselves, the extent to which there's no economic reason whatsoever to have children, and then we wonder why our birth rates are plummeting, and we say it must be because of, some so-and-so ideology, but, look at those economic conditions. Those are really interesting. But faith, I think, without going too much into detail, because I could totally bring this into a whole discussion, is an interesting one because I notice a lot of the ways Marxists get radicalized online can be in a way that is akin to a faith, akin to a religion, like, upholding particular figures that they prefer, as well as, instead of like using Marxism as a critical lens to apply to the world, more so a set of principles to which, do you conform or do you not? Are you a revisionist or not? And this whole revisionist thing, which is very big with online Marxists, I think is so akin to faith. It's very much like, it's not about whether such and such policy was good, as are you a revisionist or not. I feel like that is literally you're acting like this is gospel. And I mean, that's in
Yeah.
a form of escapism, even though that sounds like politics, that's also a form of escapism.
Fundamentalist, dogmatist textualism is what happens when people are accustomed to thinking about religion or philosophy or politics in an exoteric way and get educated in a tradition that doesn't expose them to esoteric or apophatic approaches to reality. It's a huge problem, and it's a major reason why many religions were very careful about allowing peasants to read religious texts. Because if you come at these religions from an exoteric perspective that is literalist, that is about making a transaction with a god to get worldly benefits, where you pray and you get something in exchange, these kinds of exoteric approaches that involve turning to religion to get something instrumentally, it can be very, very dangerous to get into religion with that kind of attitude. And it can be very dangerous to get into political theory with that kind of attitude.
Oh, yeah, especially when your theory of the world, a descriptive theory, and your prescriptive politics are kind of blend into this one theory of everything, which is eschatological. You have a lot of problems there.
Oh,
But
yeah.
this brings us to a lot of different topics we could discuss, which we'll get into in the back room, which the theme will be, I think, why is democracy even good, and what does democracy mean today? Because that has changed so much, and you talk about that in your book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, which you should definitely check out. Links in the description. Is there anything else you want to plug before we end this segment off?
Well, if you want to follow anything that I read, you can always check out my website, benjaminstudebaker.com. My About page has links to all of the stuff that I've written off of that blog, off-site. And I also will have a second book coming out in November, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. That will be out with Edinburgh University Press.
Nice. Thanks for being here, Benjamin. And those who aren't patrons already, what are you doing? You're missing a lot of great material coming out these days. So see you in the next segment.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.